Having trouble naming your characters? I'm here to help. Hi, I'm Carly Stevens, and this is Carly Stevens Books for all things writing, publishing, and indie author life. And naming characters is difficult. I have learned a lot along the way. I've published over 20 books in different genres, from historical to fantasy, and so I wanted to share with you some of the things that I've learned about naming characters in general, in books set in the real world, and finally in fantasy sci-fi settings. So buckle in, here we go. My ideas about how to best name your characters. Now, number one in my general advice is to make sure that your names are pronounceable, or at least guessable. There are exceptions to this, like there are exceptions to everything, but if you have a very good reason for naming your character something not easily pronounceable to your main audience, maybe you're writing a story with authentic Welsh names or something like that, then include a pronunciation guide at the beginning. That would be my advice. If you don't have a very good reason to have an unpronounceable or not easily pronounceable name, I would stick with things that people can sound out and at least have a nice educated guess about. In my first book that came out, Firion Rising, the main character, Firion, is a name that most people guess correctly if they are guessing on pronunciation. Number two, make names visually and audibly different from each other. So visually different, different numbers of syllables, but especially different first and last letters. A lot of people, when they're reading quickly, will absorb an entire word at a time by looking at the first and last letter and not necessarily sounding the name out every time. So making the name visually different from all of the others is just going to make the reading experience smoother for fast and slow readers. Audibly different is important as well. So if something looks different but is pronounced very similarly, then that could be a problem if you ever decide to read an excerpt aloud or get an audiobook made or something like that. So do take that into consideration. Do the names not look very similar, but maybe they sound similar? Switch those up. This is something that I learned the hard way when my first series, the Tanyuan Academy series, had two main characters. It's dual perspective, and the characters are Firion and Kyria. So very similar sounding names. I ended up making their stories very intertwined, and so I worked with it, but it's not something that I have striven to do again. So just don't make the mistake that I did and name your characters something that looks different and sounds different. Number three, avoid famous names. That goes for real names or fictional names. So if you name your character something like John Smith, Winston Churchill, or Zayden with an X, then those names, I would argue, are pretty much taken. John Smith is something that you can get away with, but you might want to have a character make a comment about the Pocahontas movie, or at least acknowledge that there is a famous person who is named that. In general, though, avoid those famous names because the automatic association will be with that other person and not with your character who you're trying to make into this individual. Number four is genre and tone. I said that I'm going to get into different historical considerations and sci-fi fantasy associations. So when I say genre and tone, I mean more like, is this meant to be a funny book? Is this meant to be a really serious book? Is this meant to be a smutty book or whatever? Often the names should reflect that kind of tone. It's going to enhance the overall feeling of it, if that makes sense. Certain names, like Mrs. Clutterberry, are going to be great for middle grade, humorous books, and they might not be great for the main spy in your international thriller. As always, there are exceptions. You can, if you want to, name the spy in your international thriller Mrs. Clutterberry, but think about how your name is going to come off in terms of connotation? What is the automatic association with the sound of that name? If there's any. A lot of names are very neutral, but if there is an automatic association of some sort, is that the sound that you want? Or would you prefer to have something a little bit more serious? So this is not a consideration that everybody needs to pay a lot of attention to, but it is something that is worth at least being aware of. I know that people like E.L. James are certainly aware of this. She wrote 50 Shades of Grey, so you have Anastasia Steele and you have Christian Grey. These are very, romance novel-y type names. You could put those names in other stories as well, but you get the idea. Now, if you are truly stuck, if you're somebody who struggles hardcore with names, then I have a suggestion for you. What I do when my writing has come to a screeching halt because a secondary character must be named is I will include brackets right in the spot where the name shows up, and that will give me license to continue and come up with the name later. I'll go through, I'll search for brackets, and then I can replace all of those with the name that I later come up with. So that helps me not just screech to a halt, but instead make progress, which is obviously important as writers. We don't want to have our entire story stall because we're trying to come up with the name of the barkeep. So that's something that's worked for me. Try it out, see if it works for you. Some other ideas, if you are absolutely stuck, are to go to online name generators. There are lots of them, and you can toggle between genders and genres and a lot of different, different fantasy races even. So you can look up different names there. I've done that plenty of times, and generally I don't take a name wholesale from there, but maybe I'll take part of it, or it'll spark some other idea, or whatever the case may be. It's a great tool for coming up with that next name if you are feeling stuck. Baby name sites are also really useful for naming characters, even fantasy characters. You can often search by first letter, even last letter occasionally. Meanings, that is something that I know a lot of people enjoy looking into, digging into, is the meanings of names and making sure that those match with the personality or journey of the characters. So yes, you will get all kinds of special ads targeted at you if you go to baby name sites with any regularity, but there is also that payoff of finding unusual names or name variations that you weren't aware of that match the different meanings or sounds that you're looking for. All right, let's talk about real world names now. So this is for people who write contemporary or historical books that are set in the actual world somewhere. Something to keep in mind, especially if you are a new writer writing about a time or place that you are not a part of, like maybe you didn't grow up in. Don't assume that cool names are going to translate to that new time or place. They cannot necessarily be used anywhere. So for example, some names just are not going to be historically accurate because they were not names that existed at that time. Wendy, for example, the name Wendy, I know that's not a cool name necessarily that pops to the top of your mind, but Wendy was not a name that existed before James Barrie wrote Peter Pan. After that, it became a name. So if you're writing a story set in the 1700s, you cannot have a character named Wendy. So do a couple Google searches, see when these names, if you're in doubt, appeared so you can stay historically accurate. Or if you are writing in a different place rather than a different time, check the naming conventions of those places as well. The name Sarah may be really common in the US, but it's not going to be as common in other parts of the world. So do your research. Make sure that you know not only which names are popular. It's not like you need to name every character a popular name for a particular place, but what are the naming conventions? The naming conventions are totally different in different parts of the world. If you're writing, for example, a character from Russia who lives in the 1870s, then you will have to give that person a first name, a patronymic, and a last name. That patronymic is attached to the first name of the father. So it's a different naming system than you get here in the US. So being aware of some of those things is important to the story and like your integrity as an author. If you're going to write in a historical way or in a real world sense, your naming needs to make sense. Otherwise, people from that time, from that place, are potentially going to read your book and say, the heck is this? Somebody didn't do their research, somebody doesn't really know what they're talking about. Now, if you want to name your character something that might not fully match expectations for one reason or another, then just have an explanation for that. Have a reason for why that is the case, but definitely do your research. Often there are lists of like the top 100 baby names by year and location. So you can do a quick search and find some of those. So even if your main character does not have a popular name, the characters around that character should probably at least dip into that top 100 to give your story the flavor that makes sense for that time and place. All right, fantasy sci-fi people, we are back. So most of the books that I've written are fantasy of one stripe or another. I've written cozy fantasy, spicy, romantasy, young adult epic fantasy. I've done a lot of different types. So once again, I remind you, please keep your names pronounceable and different enough from one another that it's easy to see and hear the difference between them. If you're creating different cultures or lands or planets in your story and you want to make it very clear which people come from which place, you can do that with names, among other things, of course, but you can do that with names. Something that was a kind of a revelatory piece of advice for me as I was creating different cultures and such for the Tenuan Academy series was to prioritize certain letters and deprioritize other letters by culture. So if you think about real world cultures that prioritize some sounds over others, then you can often tell where somebody is from, or you can guess if you hear their name. So you take Native Hawaiian names, for example. There is a range of sounds that are very commonly used, and then there are other sounds that are not used at all. Something else you can do is to look up words in other languages that mean what you want your character names to mean. I've had students who love that kind of Easter egg where they look up a defining characteristic of their character in a variety of languages and then take that word but kind of tweak it to turn it into something that looks more like a name. I've done this as well. I've done this with Greek, I've done this with Arabic, depending on the culture that I want to kind of evoke in the story. So it's a cool option. I've also heard of smashing the keyboard and adding vowels in between. That seems a little bit silly to me, but if it works for you and it still is something that appears pronounceable, then great. You can give it a shot and let me know how that goes. Something else that I've done for series in particular is to keep a story Bible. I'm not that faithful with it, but for this one particular series, I started out with a series Bible that just had a bunch of notes on like the places and the names that I'd already used. So anytime I included a new character, I would hop over there, I would add it in alphabetically, and then I would know what names I'd already used, and if I was starting to use a ton of names that started with the same letter. So that way, if I needed to come up with a new name for somebody in that series, I could look and see what letters had not been used as often and kind of mix things up that way. For me, using a story Bible has been a hit or miss kind of tool. I don't do it for most of my projects, but for one series I did, and it's been helpful for not repeating names and things like that. So give it a shot. If you are coming up with a spicy romantasy series like I did for this story Bible, or a cozy mystery series that you expect to go on for a while, it could be a good idea just to make sure that you don't retread the same kinds of names. All right, that is it for today. If you would like more resources for writers, you can check out the rest of the channel. You can also go to my website, carly-stevens.com. And that's it. Check out those resources there. Like this video if you like it. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe for more writing, publishing, and indie author life stuff. And I'll see you next week. Bye.